Some doors don't lead to places, they lead to destinies you never saw coming. Ava Brooks had worked 16 straight hours without sitting down for more than 5 minutes at a time. The emergency department had been overflowing since sunrise, and by the time her shift finally ended, every muscle in her body felt like it belonged to someone twice her age. She adjusted the faded navy blue scrub jacket hanging loosely over her shoulders and stepped through the sliding glass doors of St. Gabriel Medical Center into the cold Chicago rain. Water splashed across the parking lot in silver sheets as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. Her rideshare app had frozen twice because of the storm, her phone battery blinked at 3%, and exhaustion clouded every thought. She pulled her hood over her tightly braided hair, hugged her worn backpack against her chest, and hurried toward the line of black SUVs waiting along the curb. One of them had its rear passenger door slightly open, just enough to make her believe the driver had arrived for her. Without looking twice, she climbed inside and closed the door behind her, grateful to escape the freezing rain. The warmth inside the vehicle wrapped around her immediately, carrying the faint scent of expensive leather and cedar. Ava exhaled deeply and leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes for only a second before whispering, "Rough night." No one answered. That silence felt strange. She opened her eyes and slowly turned her head. 3 men wearing tailored black suits sat perfectly still. Their expressions never changed. The driver stared straight ahead. The man in the front passenger seat never even blinked. Another broad-shouldered man beside her watched through the tinted window as though she did not exist. Then her eyes settled on the figure seated across from her. He looked to be in his mid-30s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal overcoat over a black suit that seemed untouched by the rain outside. His posture was effortless, his hands folded calmly in his lap, and his dark eyes rested on her with a level of composure that made the air itself feel heavier. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He simply observed her, as though he had already measured every possibility before she spoke a single word. Ava's heartbeat quickened. She looked through the rain-covered window and realized the hospital entrance was already several yards away. I'm so sorry," she said quickly, reaching for the door handle. It wouldn't move. She pulled again. Still locked. Her pulse climbed another notch. "I think I got into the wrong car." Nobody responded. The windshield wipers swept rhythmically across the glass while the rain continued drumming against the roof. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Finally, the man across from her spoke, his voice calm enough to make the silence around it even more unsettling. "Drive." The SUV eased away from the curb without hesitation. Ava's eyes widened. "Wait, please. There has to be some misunderstanding. My apartment is only 15 minutes from here. You can just let me out at the next corner." The driver never acknowledged her. Neither did the others. The city lights reflected across the rain-soaked streets as the hospital disappeared behind them. Ava gripped the strap of her backpack tighter, silently reminding herself not to panic. Hospitals had taught her that fear only made people stop thinking. Breathe first. Solve the problem second. She stole another glance toward the mysterious man. He had not looked away once. His expression remained unreadable, almost peaceful, as though every unexpected event in the world simply became another detail to evaluate. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth lifted into something that was not quite a smile. "You're very calm," he said quietly. Ava swallowed. "I'm trying to be." His eyes remained fixed on hers for another long moment before he asked a question that somehow unsettled her even more than the locked doors. "Tell me, Nurse Brooks, why did you assume this car was waiting for you?" The color drained from her face. She had never told anyone her name. Ava felt every instinct telling her to demand answers, yet years in an emergency room had taught her that panic rarely solved anything. She loosened her grip on her backpack just enough to keep her hands from shaking. The man across from her waited with remarkable patience, as though silence itself was another language he spoke fluently. Rain continued sliding down the dark windows, turning the bright city lights into blurred ribbons of gold and white. Finally, Ava found her voice. You know my name because you saw my hospital badge when I got in. The man studied her for a moment before giving a slight nod. A reasonable assumption. His answer was neither confirmation nor denial. It only deepened the mystery. Ava lowered her eyes for a second, replaying every moment since she had stepped into the vehicle. She had never introduced herself. Her badge was tucked beneath her jacket after leaving the hospital. Even if someone had noticed it, the embroidered letters were too small to read from across the cabin. Something did not add up. "Who are you?" she asked carefully. The driver continued navigating through the rain without a word. The two men beside him remained perfectly still, almost like statues dressed in tailored suits. The only sound inside the vehicle was the quiet hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers. The man finally answered. "My name is Daniel Kong." He spoke it without pride or hesitation, simply as a fact. Ava searched her memory. The name sounded familiar, but after working endless shifts with hundreds of patients every month, countless names blurred together. "Have we met before?" she asked. Daniel shook his head once. "No." Another long silence settled between them. Instead of fear, curiosity slowly began replacing the tight knot in Ava's chest. She noticed details she had missed earlier. Every man in the vehicle wore a simple silver pin shaped like a soaring hawk on the lapel of his jacket. Their shoes were spotless despite the storm. Their movements were economical, disciplined, almost rehearsed. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody made small talk. It felt less like riding with strangers and more like entering a world governed by rules she could not see. Daniel watched her eyes move from one detail to another. "You observe before you speak," he said. "Most people speak before they think." Ava offered a tired smile. "Patience. Teach you that. Sometimes what they do tells you more than what they say." For the first time, something softened in Daniel's expression. It was subtle enough that another person might have missed it, but Ava noticed the slight easing around his eyes. "Interesting," he murmured. The SUV slowed as a traffic light turned red. Outside, a young couple hurried across the intersection beneath one umbrella, laughing as the rain soaked their shoes. Ava instinctively reached for her phone to check the time, only to remember the battery had died. "Could you at least tell me where we are going?" she asked. Daniel looked through the rain-speckled glass before answering. "Somewhere safe until this misunderstanding is resolved." Safe. The word should have reassured her, yet it only created another question. Safe from what? Before she could ask, a soft chime echoed through the cabin. One of the men in front glanced discreetly at a secure communication device mounted beside the dashboard. His calm expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He turned halfway toward Daniel and spoke for the first time since the journey began. "Sir, there has been a change." Daniel nodded once without asking for details. He seemed to understand immediately. The driver quietly adjusted course, guiding the SUV away from the downtown streets and toward a quieter stretch of road lined with old warehouses and brick buildings. Ava noticed the change in direction immediately. The hospital district was long behind them now. Whatever destination Daniel had planned only moments earlier had suddenly changed, and judging by the growing seriousness inside the vehicle, she realized with quiet certainty that her accidental ride had become part of something far larger than either of them had expected. Ava watched the rain blur against the window as the city slowly transformed around them. Bright hospital towers gave way to quiet industrial streets where old brick warehouses stood like forgotten monuments beneath the gray sky. She had lived in Chicago her entire life, yet this part of the city felt strangely unfamiliar. Every turn the SUV made seemed carefully chosen, every stoplight timed with deliberate precision. Nobody inside the vehicle appeared anxious, but everyone seemed prepared for something unseen. Ava folded her hands together and forced herself to breathe evenly. She had spent years calming frightened families in waiting rooms, reminding them that fear often grew larger than reality. Now she repeated the same lesson silently to herself. Daniel Kong broke the silence first. "You are wondering why nobody is speaking." Ava looked at him honestly. "I am wondering about a lot of things." A faint trace of amusement appeared in his eyes. "Good. Curiosity keeps people alive longer than confidence. She considered the unusual answer before replying. At the hospital, confidence saves lives too. Daniel nodded once. Only when it is earned. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. The distance between complete strangers had become a conversation between two people who respected careful thinking. Ava glanced toward the dashboard and noticed a framed photograph tucked neatly beside one of the digital displays. It showed an elderly Korean woman smiling warmly while holding a little boy's hand beside a blooming cherry tree. The image seemed strangely ordinary inside such an extraordinary vehicle. Daniel followed her gaze without turning his head. "My grandmother," he said quietly. Ava smiled instinctively. "She has kind eyes." Daniel looked at the photograph for a brief moment before returning his attention to the road ahead. "She believed a person's character is revealed by how they treat people who cannot repay them." Ava recognized the sentence immediately because her own mother had repeated something remarkably similar throughout her childhood. "My mother says respect costs nothing but changes everything." Daniel looked back at her with quiet interest. Perhaps wise people eventually reach the same conclusions. Before Ava could answer, a soft vibration echoed through the cabin. The driver glanced toward the secure communication screen again, his expression remaining disciplined but noticeably more alert. "Arrival time has changed," he informed Daniel calmly. "Approximately 12 minutes. Daniel acknowledged him with a simple nod. Ava noticed no frustration, no impatience, only quiet acceptance. Whoever this man truly was, he carried authority without raising his voice. That alone made him different from many powerful people she had encountered. Suddenly another sound interrupted the calm atmosphere. It was not an alarm from the vehicle. It came from Ava's backpack. She immediately recognized the faint electronic beeping. Her portable medical monitor. Without hesitation, she unzipped the bag and removed a compact device connected to a small insulated pouch. Daniel observed every movement without interfering. Ava quickly checked the display, her expression changing. "That is not good," she whispered. Daniel asked. "What happened?" "I was transporting temperature-sensitive medication for a pediatric patient whose insurance could not cover same-day delivery. I volunteered to bring it after my shift because the family lives near my apartment." She looked toward the insulated pouch again, concern replacing every trace of fear she had felt moments earlier. "If it stays outside the proper temperature range for too long, the medication will no longer be effective." Daniel studied her face carefully. She was no longer worried about herself. She was thinking only about a child she had never even mentioned until now. He asked one quiet question. "How much time do you have?" Ava checked the monitor again before answering. "Less than 30 minutes. The cabin fell silent once more. Outside, the rain continued falling over Chicago, but inside the vehicle Daniel Kong found himself looking at the exhausted nurse very differently than he had only minutes before. Most people trapped in an unfamiliar situation would have focused entirely on their own safety. Ava Brooks had almost forgotten her own predicament because somewhere across the city a child was depending on her to keep a promise. Ava looked at the small temperature monitor again as the numbers continued their slow climb. Every passing minute reduced the chance that the medication would remain usable. She closed the insulated pouch carefully, almost protectively, then let out a quiet breath. "I promised his mother I would bring this myself," she said. "She works 2 jobs and cannot leave her son alone for very long." Daniel remained silent for several seconds. He had negotiated multimillion-dollar deals without hesitation, yet the quiet determination in Ava's voice demanded more attention than any business meeting ever had. She was not asking for sympathy. She was not complaining about the inconvenience. She was simply worried that a child might lose something important because of circumstances beyond his control. Daniel glanced toward the driver. "How far are we from the address on the medication?" The driver answered immediately. "Approximately 8 miles. 24 minutes in this weather." Ava lowered her eyes. "That is too close. If traffic slows again, it may not make it." Daniel extended his hand. "May I see it?" She hesitated only briefly before handing him the insulated pouch. He examined the hospital label attached to the side. Every detail had been carefully documented with the professionalism he would expect from someone who respected her work. There was no sign of carelessness. No attempt to dramatize the situation. Everything about Ava Brooks reflected quiet responsibility. Daniel returned the pouch to her with the same care she had shown. You volunteered after working 16 hours? Ava nodded. The hospital courier service ended for the day. Someone still had to deliver it. And you were not paid extra? She smiled faintly. Children do not get to choose when they need help. Daniel looked out the rain-covered window. His grandmother had once told him that the strongest people were rarely the loudest. They were the ones who quietly carried burdens that nobody else noticed. For reasons he could not explain, that memory surfaced now with unusual clarity. Another soft chime interrupted his thoughts. The driver received a new message through the secure communication system. Sir, he said calmly, Mr. Choi has arrived earlier than expected. Daniel considered the information without changing his expression. Whatever meeting had been planned clearly mattered, yet he looked once more at the small insulated pouch resting in Ava's hands. The contrast between those two responsibilities seemed strangely simple to him. One represented power. The other represented compassion. Change the route, Daniel said. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror, surprised for the first time that evening. Sir? Take Nurse Brooks to the delivery address first. The cabin became perfectly still. Even the two silent men seated nearby exchanged the slightest glance before returning their attention forward. Daniel rarely adjusted his schedule for anyone. Ava blinked in disbelief. You do not have to do that. I know. You said you had somewhere important to be. I do. She looked at him with genuine confusion. Then why? Daniel answered without hesitation. Because somewhere in this city a child is waiting for someone who keeps her promises. Ava felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. For the first time since entering the wrong vehicle, she no longer felt trapped. She still knew almost nothing about Daniel Kong, but one thing had become clear. Beneath his calm exterior existed a man who measured strength differently than most people. The SUV turned smoothly onto another street, leaving its original destination behind as downtown traffic slowly faded into quieter neighborhoods. Ava watched familiar streets begin to appear through the rain, unaware that the simple decision Daniel had just made would quietly alter both of their lives in ways either of them could possibly imagine. Ava watched familiar neighborhoods emerge through the rain as the SUV left the downtown streets behind. Small brick homes lined the avenue, porch lights glowing softly against the gray afternoon, while puddles reflected rows of maple trees swaying in the wind. She checked the monitor again and released a quiet sigh of relief. The temperature had stabilized just enough to keep the medication within its safe range. We still have a chance, she whispered more to herself than anyone else. Daniel noticed the change in her expression. You have carried that bag the entire day, he said. Not once did you set it down. Ava smiled gently. Some things are too important to forget, even when you are exhausted. The SUV slowed in front of a modest apartment building where colorful pinwheels decorated a tiny flower bed near the entrance. Before the driver could step out, Ava had already opened the door. Thank you, she said sincerely. I will only need a few minutes. Daniel nodded once. We will wait. Ava hurried through the rain, shielding the insulated pouch beneath her jacket. Daniel watched from inside the vehicle as she climbed the front steps and knocked on the apartment door. A young woman answered almost immediately, worry written across her face until she saw the hospital bag. Relief replaced every trace of anxiety. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the gratitude in the mother's smile. Ava spoke with her for several moments, carefully explaining the medication and answering questions with the same patience she had shown inside the hospital every day. She knelt briefly so she could greet a little boy standing shyly behind his mother. The child held a stuffed elephant tucked beneath one arm and smiled when Ava handed him a small sticker from her pocket. It was such a simple gesture that none of the men inside the SUV expected it. She carries stickers? One of Daniel's associates asked quietly, almost surprised. Daniel continued watching. Apparently. The little boy waved enthusiastically as Ava stood to leave. His mother reached for her wallet, but Ava politely shook her head before offering one last reassuring smile. She accepted nothing in return except a heartfelt thank you. As she hurried back through the rain, Daniel found himself remembering countless people who had approached him asking for favors, opportunities, or money. Ava Brooks had just spent her own time, her own energy, and even paid for transportation out of her own pocket simply because she believed helping someone mattered. She climbed back into the SUV, slightly out of breath and brushing raindrops from her sleeves. "Everything is all right now," she said with quiet satisfaction. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before asking, "Why did you refuse the money?" Ava seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "Because the medication was already paid for. Your time was not." She looked out the rain-covered window where the little boy was still waving from behind the glass. "Some payments do not belong in a wallet." The answer lingered in the silent cabin. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly, recalling his grandmother's favorite saying that wealth could buy comfort but never character. As the SUV pulled away from the apartment building, Ava noticed a folded children's drawing resting on the seat beside her. It must have slipped from the little boy's hand when she left. She picked it up carefully. Across the front, written in large uneven letters with bright blue crayon, were the words, "Thank you, Nurse Ava." She smiled without realizing Daniel was watching. In that quiet moment, he understood something unexpected. The woman sitting across from him had entered his vehicle by accident, yet somehow she had already changed the atmosphere inside it, replacing suspicion with something none of them had anticipated. Respect. The SUV continued through the quiet streets as the storm gradually weakened, leaving only a fine mist drifting beneath the streetlights. Ava carefully folded the little boy's drawing and slipped it inside her backpack beside the now empty insulated pouch. It felt like the longest day of her life, yet somehow it no longer felt like the worst. Daniel noticed the simple gesture but said nothing. Outside, the city seemed to breathe more slowly after the rain, while inside the vehicle an unfamiliar calm had settled over everyone. The secure communication device chimed once again. This time the driver glanced toward Daniel before speaking. "Sir, the meeting has been postponed. The guests are waiting at the estate whenever you arrive." Daniel nodded quietly. "Very well." Ava looked toward him. "You delayed your schedule because of someone you did not even know." Daniel answered without looking away from the window. "Perhaps I know enough now." She smiled politely. "I am not sure you know much about me." He turned back toward her. "I know that after working 16 hours, you thought first about a child instead of yourself. I know you refused payment for something that took your own time and energy. I know you remained calm in a situation that would frighten most people." Ava lowered her eyes, almost embarrassed by the compliment. "That is simply my job." Daniel shook his head gently. "No. Your profession may require knowledge. What you showed today required character." Before Ava could respond, the vehicle slowed before an elegant iron gate that opened silently onto a private tree-lined driveway. Beyond it stood a large stone residence surrounded by carefully maintained gardens glistening with fresh rain. It was beautiful without being extravagant, its warm lights glowing through tall windows rather than demanding attention. Ava stared quietly. She had expected something intimidating. Instead, the place felt unexpectedly peaceful. "Is this your home?" she asked. "It is one of the places where I work," Daniel replied. The distinction caught her attention. He did not call it a mansion or an estate. He simply called it a place where he worked. As the SUV rolled to a gentle stop beneath a covered entrance, a middle-aged house manager opened the front door before anyone had stepped outside. His expression remained composed until he noticed Ava sitting beside Daniel. Surprise crossed his face for only a brief second before perfect professionalism returned. Daniel stepped from the vehicle and then turned back toward Ava. "Would you join us for a cup of tea before we arrange transportation home?" Ava hesitated. Every instinct told her she should leave, thank him, and return to her ordinary life. Yet another part of her wanted answers. Nothing about this day had been ordinary from the moment she entered the wrong vehicle. Only for a little while, she said. My mother will worry if I arrive too late. Daniel inclined his head respectfully. Then we will not keep you longer than necessary. As they walked toward the entrance, Ava noticed something unexpected mounted beside the front doors. Instead of a family crest or expensive artwork, there was a polished bronze plaque engraved with a single sentence. Respect is remembered longer than power. Ava slowed for a moment, reading the words twice. Daniel noticed her pause but continued walking without explanation. She did not realize that the sentence had once belonged to his grandmother, or that before the evening was over she would discover why those words mattered more to Daniel Kahn than everything waiting for him behind those doors. The warmth inside the residence felt completely different from the cold rain they had left behind. Soft amber lights reflected across polished hardwood floors, while the quiet scent of fresh tea and cedar filled the air. Nothing about the house suggested unnecessary luxury. Every painting, every bookshelf, every carefully chosen chair seemed to belong to someone who valued history more than display. Ava followed Daniel through a long hallway until they entered a sunlit sitting room overlooking a peaceful garden where raindrops still rested on the leaves. A silver tea service had already been prepared without anyone asking. The house manager poured 2 cups before quietly excusing himself, leaving the room wrapped in comfortable silence. Ava accepted the warm porcelain cup with both hands. Thank you, she said. Daniel nodded. My grandmother believed conversations should begin with tea instead of assumptions. Ava smiled softly. Your grandmother sounds like someone I would have liked. Daniel looked toward an old framed photograph resting on the fireplace mantel. It was the same smiling woman she had noticed earlier inside the vehicle. Most people did. For several moments neither of them spoke. Outside, birds cautiously returned to the garden after the storm, hopping across the wet stone path as if nothing unusual had happened that day. Ava finally asked the question she had been carrying since leaving the hospital. Why were you so calm when I entered your vehicle? Daniel rested his cup on the table before answering. Because frightened people often reveal their true character in the first few minutes. And what did you see? He looked directly at her. Someone who apologized before making excuses. Someone who remained respectful even while afraid. Someone who thought about a sick child before thinking about herself. Ava lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. Compliments had never been comfortable for her. You give me too much credit. Daniel shook his head gently. No. I simply pay attention. His words lingered in the quiet room. Ava noticed another photograph on a nearby shelf. This one showed Daniel standing beside several doctors during the opening of a children's health center. She looked back at him with surprise. You support hospitals? Daniel followed her gaze. Several. Why? His answer came almost immediately. Because years ago, a hospital gave my family more time together than we expected. Ava sensed there was more to the story, but she respected the silence that followed. Working in medicine had taught her that some memories needed to be offered, never demanded. Just then the house manager returned carrying a small wooden box. He placed it carefully beside Daniel and quietly said, Sir, this arrived from storage this afternoon. Daniel opened the lid and paused. Inside rested neatly organized letters, photographs, and a faded hospital identification bracelet preserved inside a protective case. He reached toward the bracelet, almost absent-mindedly before stopping. Ava recognized the familiar design immediately. It belonged to St. Gabriel Medical Center, the same hospital where she worked every day. She leaned forward slightly, surprised. That is from my hospital. Daniel looked at the bracelet in silence for several seconds before turning it over. A handwritten note remained attached beneath the clear protective sleeve. Time had faded the ink, but one sentence could still be read clearly. Never forget the nurse who stayed after everyone else had gone home. Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly as he read those words again. Ava looked from the bracelet to Daniel, sensing that an invisible thread had quietly connected their lives long before either of them realized it. Neither of them understood the full meaning yet, but somewhere within that small wooden box waited an answer that would change everything they believed about the extraordinary day that had begun with a simple mistake. Daniel carefully lifted the hospital bracelet from the wooden box as though it were made of glass instead of plastic. Years had faded its color, but the name of the medical center remained perfectly clear. Ava recognized the style immediately because she fastened bracelets just like it around patients' wrists at the beginning of every shift. "Someone in your family was treated there," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "My grandmother spent her final weeks at that hospital." His voice remained steady, but the silence surrounding his words carried years of memory. He unfolded one of the carefully preserved letters resting beneath the bracelet. The paper had yellowed with age, and the edges had softened from being opened countless times. "She wrote this after returning home," he explained. "She insisted I keep it where I would never forget it." Ava listened without interrupting. Daniel read a single passage aloud. "The finest person I met during my illness never asked what our family owned, never cared who visited my room, and never expected recognition. She simply stayed because kindness was part of who she was." He lowered the letter slowly. "My grandmother spent months trying to discover the nurse's name. Hospital policy protected the staff, so she never learned who it was." Ava looked at the faded handwriting with quiet admiration. "She must have meant a great deal to your grandmother." Daniel smiled gently. "She did more than provide medical care. She reminded my grandmother that compassion still existed." Ava's eyes drifted toward the old bracelet again. "There are many nurses like that." Daniel shook his head. "Perhaps. But my grandmother believed extraordinary people often go unnoticed because they never seek attention." The house manager quietly stepped back into the room carrying a slim archive folder. "Sir, these were found with the letters." Daniel accepted it with a thankful nod and opened the file. Inside rested several copies of volunteer schedules from the hospital, preserved alongside handwritten notes from his grandmother. One page slipped free and landed softly on the coffee table. Ava instinctively reached down to pick it up. Her eyes widened the moment she recognized the familiar handwriting. "This?" she whispered. Daniel looked toward her. "Do you recognize it?" Ava nodded slowly. "That handwriting belongs to my mother." She turned the page over carefully, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. "She volunteered at St. Gabriel for years before arthritis forced her to stop. She always stayed after her shift ended whenever patients needed someone to talk to." Daniel stared at her in complete silence. Ava continued reading until she reached the signature at the bottom. There was no doubt. It was her mother's name. A gentle smile formed despite the emotion filling her eyes. She never talked much about it. She always said kindness should leave quietly. Daniel looked from the letter to Ava as countless small moments from the day suddenly aligned in his mind. The calm under pressure. The refusal to accept payment. The instinct to place others first. They had not appeared by accident. They had been learned, lived, and passed from one generation to the next. He folded the letter with great care before returning it to the box. "Then today I finally met the family my grandmother spent years praying would be blessed." Ava felt a quiet chill despite the warmth of the room. She had entered a stranger's vehicle believing it was nothing more than an unfortunate mistake. Instead, every unexpected turn had quietly led her to a story that had begun long before either of them realized their lives had already been connected through an act of kindness that no one had ever expected to be remembered. Daniel closed the wooden box with both hands, not because the story had ended, but because it had finally come full circle. For years he had believed that the nurse his grandmother spoke about would remain an unanswered mystery, a nameless act of kindness preserved only through fading letters and memories. Yet on an ordinary rainy afternoon, after one unexpected mistake, he found himself sitting across from the daughter of the woman who had quietly changed his grandmother's final days. Neither wealth nor influence had made that meeting possible. It had been simple compassion, passed from one generation to the next. Ava glanced toward the clock on the mantel and smiled apologetically. "I should go. My mother will be waiting for me, and she worries if I am late." Daniel stood immediately. Of course. There was no attempt to persuade her to stay longer. Respect, he had learned from his grandmother, also meant knowing when to let someone return to the life they loved. They walked together toward the front entrance as the evening sky slowly brightened beyond the clouds. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the gardens sparkling beneath the last light of the day. Before the house manager opened the door, Daniel reached into the wooden box one final time and removed the preserved letter. "Would you mind giving this to your mother?" he asked quietly. Ava accepted it with both hands. "Are you sure? It belongs with the family who inspired it." She looked at the carefully folded paper, then back at Daniel. "She will probably tell you she was only doing what anyone should have done." A gentle smile crossed Daniel's face. "That is exactly what my grandmother predicted she would say." Outside, the black SUV waited at the front drive, ready to take Ava home. Before she stepped inside, Daniel handed her a small business card. There was no company logo, no impressive title, only his name and a private telephone number. "If your family ever needs anything," he said, "I hope you will allow me the opportunity to return a kindness that has waited many years." Ava slipped the card into her backpack beside the little boy's drawing. "Thank you. But I hope the only reason we meet again is under happier circumstances." Daniel inclined his head. "I would like that." The drive to Ava's neighborhood was peaceful. Neither of them felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. Sometimes the strongest understanding was built through shared silence. When the SUV stopped outside her modest apartment building, Ava stepped onto the sidewalk and turned back once before closing the door. Daniel remained seated inside the vehicle, watching as she climbed the familiar front steps carrying nothing more than her backpack, a child's drawing, and a letter that had traveled through time to find its rightful home. She disappeared safely inside, and only then did he quietly instruct the driver to leave. Days later, a new children's patient care program quietly appeared at St. Gabriel Medical Center, funded anonymously with no speeches, no photographs, and no public recognition. The only request attached to the donation was a single engraved sentence placed near the pediatric entrance where every family could read it. "Respect is remembered longer than power." Ava never spoke publicly about the extraordinary day that had begun with an honest mistake, and Daniel never told anyone why one rainy afternoon had changed the way he measured success forever. Yet somewhere inside a small apartment, an elderly woman unfolded a letter she had not seen in decades, smiled through grateful tears, and whispered that kindness always finds its way home. And on that quiet evening, the world remembered that the greatest legacies are rarely built through power alone, but through ordinary people who choose compassion when no one is watching.